August 17th, 1942. Dawn broke over RAF Polbrook in Northamptonshire, England, as the ground crews watched 12 Boeing B-17E Flying Fortresses lumber down the runway, their Wright Cyclone engines thundering in the early morning light. In the lead aircraft, christened Butcher Shop, Major Paul Tibbets gripped the controls while Brigadier General Ira Eaker occupied the observer's seat. Behind them, the largest American bombing force yet assembled in Europe climbed into formation, bound for the railroad marshalling yards at Rouen-Sotteville in occupied France. This modest beginning would mark the start of a campaign that would fundamentally alter the nature of aerial warfare. What German pilots witnessed in those first encounters would transform from curiosity to concern, then to something approaching disbelief, as American bomber formations grew from small groups to massive aerial armadas that darkened European skies. The evolution of this threat, from those initial 12 aircraft to formations of nearly 1,000 bombers flying in coordinated waves, would force the Luftwaffe to reimagine everything they thought they knew about air combat. The first mission proceeded almost flawlessly, escorted by 4 squadrons of RAF Spitfire 9s, with 5 additional Spitfire squadrons covering the withdrawal. The small American formation dropped 16.5 tons of ordnance from 23,000 feet. Approximately 50% of the bombs struck the target area. All 12 B-17s returned safely to England, though 2 escort fighters were lost along with 2 German interceptors. For the Americans, it seemed to validate their entire strategic bombing doctrine. For the Germans monitoring this initial raid, the appearance of American heavy bombers represented a development worth noting, but hardly alarming. German Fighter Command initially viewed these early American raids with measured interest rather than concern. The Luftwaffe had spent years perfecting tactics against RAF bomber formations flying at night, and had developed sophisticated defensive systems incorporating radar, ground controllers, and experienced fighter pilots. The appearance of a few dozen American bombers flying in daylight seemed almost quaint compared to the massive night raids the RAF was conducting. German intelligence reports from late 1942 cataloged the B-17 specifications with professional detachment, noting its defensive armament, altitude capabilities, and bombing accuracy without particular alarm. But American bomber strength was building far more rapidly than German planners anticipated. By May 1943, the small force that had conducted those first raids had expanded fourfold. The 8th Air Force had organized into the 1st and 3rd bombardment wings, each comprising multiple bomb groups with dozens of aircraft. The scale of American industrial mobilization was becoming apparent in the skies over Europe, as formations that had numbered 12 bombers in August 1942 now consisted of hundreds of aircraft flying in carefully orchestrated waves. The tactical formation that would define American strategic bombing emerged from months of experimentation and combat experience. The Combat Box, developed primarily by Colonel Curtis LeMay during his tenure as a bomb group commander, represented a revolutionary approach to defensive bombing. Unlike previous formations that emphasized linear patterns, the Combat Box stacked bombers in 3 dimensions, creating overlapping fields of defensive fire that could theoretically repel fighter attacks from any angle. The basic building block was the 3 aircraft element, arranged in a shallow V formation. 4 such elements comprised a squadron of 12 bombers, with each element positioned at different altitudes and lateral positions relative to the squadron leader. These squadrons were then stacked to form 18 aircraft group formations, with high, middle, and low squadrons arranged in what became known as the Javelin Down configuration, stepped diagonally downward toward the sun to aid gunner visibility. When 3 such groups combined into a combat wing formation, the result was a massive box of 54 B-17s, occupying roughly 1.3 miles of airspace horizontally and several thousand feet vertically. Each bomber bristled with up to 13 50 caliber machine guns, depending on the model. A 54-plane formation could theoretically bring nearly 700 heavy machine guns to bear on attacking fighters, creating what American planners called an impenetrable screen of fire. The mathematics of this defensive firepower were impressive on paper. Each B-17 carried thousands of rounds of ammunition distributed across multiple gun positions: nose, chin turret, top turret, ball turret, tail turret, and waist positions. The Browning AN-M2 .50 caliber machine gun, firing at approximately 800 rounds per minute, had an effective range exceeding 1,000 yards. Gunners trained to track fast-moving targets and deliver sustained fire, with tracer rounds helping them walk their shots onto enemy aircraft. German pilots encountering these formations for the first time experienced a profound tactical shock. Oberleutnant Wilhelm Meyer of Jagdgeschwader II, an experienced fighter pilot with multiple victories against RAF bombers, led one of the first Luftwaffe attacks against a large American formation in late 1942. His post-mission report, preserved in Luftwaffe archives, captured the moment of recognition that American bombers represented something entirely new. "We approached the formation from astern, standard attack profile against heavy bombers," Mayer reported to his squadron intelligence officer. "At 2,000 meters, we could see perhaps 30 fortresses in tight formation, stacked at different altitudes. As we closed to effective range, the defensive fire began. I have attacked RAF Lancaster formations many times. This was completely different. The volume of fire was unprecedented. Tracer rounds formed solid lines between the bombers and our fighters. It was like flying into a wall of steel." Mayer's attack achieved limited success, damaging 2 bombers that fell out of formation, but cost his staffel 2 fighters destroyed and 3 more damaged. The exchange rate, calculated in Luftwaffe headquarters that evening, was concerning. Trading 1 or 2 German fighters for each bomber destroyed was unsustainable, especially as American bomber numbers continued to grow, while German pilot training programs struggled to replace losses. The defensive coordination within these formations was remarkably sophisticated. Lead navigators and bombardiers planned approach routes that maximized the formation's defensive capabilities while minimizing exposure to known flak concentrations. Radio discipline allowed group leaders to warn of incoming fighter attacks and coordinate defensive maneuvers. Gunners trained extensively on aircraft recognition, learning to distinguish friendly escort fighters from German interceptors at maximum visual range. More importantly, the psychological effect of flying in these massive formations provided bomber crews with a sense of collective strength that individual aircraft could never achieve. Pilots and crewmen reported that being part of a combat box, surrounded by dozens of other bombers, created confidence that sustained morale even during fierce attacks. The sight of neighboring B-17s maintaining formation despite battle damage, with gunners continuing to fire and engines trailing smoke, reinforced the determination to complete the mission regardless of cost. German fighter pilots quickly recognized that standard stern attacks, which had proven effective against previous bomber types, were suicide against American combat boxes. A fighter approaching from behind entered the engagement envelope of not just one bomber's tail guns, but the combined fire of multiple aircraft whose gunners had overlapping fields of fire. Luftwaffe intelligence calculated that a fighter making a standard rear attack on a 54 plane formation could face fire from over 40 50 caliber machine guns simultaneously. Major Egon Mayer, one of the Luftwaffe's most innovative tacticians, developed the head-on attack specifically to counter American defensive formations. The concept exploited the B-17's relative weakness in forward-firing armament. Early model B-17Es and Fs carried only 4 machine guns covering the frontal arc, compared to the multiple gun positions protecting the rear and sides. A fighter attacking head-on would be exposed to defensive fire for only seconds, as the closing speed between fighter and bomber approached 500 miles per hour. The execution of head-on attacks required extraordinary skill and nerves of steel. German pilots would position their formations several miles ahead of the incoming bombers, climbing to altitude advantage. As the bomber formation approached, fighters would roll into shallow dives, building speed to approximately 400 miles per hour. The attack window was brutally narrow. At a combined closing rate of nearly 700 feet per second, pilots had perhaps half a second to aim, fire, and break away before a collision became inevitable. The first time I executed a proper head-on attack, I nearly froze at the controls, recalled Feldwebel Klaus Brettschneider in a post-war interview. You see this massive bomber coming straight at you, growing larger every fraction of a second. Your every instinct screams to break away, but you must hold steady, aim for the cockpit, fire your burst, and only then dive away. The margin between success and collision is measured in meters and milliseconds. I saw 3 of my comrades die in training, misjudging their breakaway point. The effectiveness of head-on attacks was proven almost immediately. By December 1942, it had become the preferred method for engaging American bomber formations. Casualties among bomber crews mounted steadily as B-17s were destroyed or crippled by attacks that concentrated on the most vulnerable part of the aircraft. Pilots and co-pilots, exposed behind relatively thin-nosed plexiglass and limited frontal armor, were particularly vulnerable. Bombardiers and navigators working in the nose section suffered horrific casualties as 20 mm cannon shells and machine gun fire tore through their workstations. Yet, even as German tactics evolved to counter American formations, the scale of the bombing campaign was expanding beyond anything the Luftwaffe had anticipated. The dual raid on Schweinfurt and Regensburg on August 17, 1943, exactly 1 year after that first modest mission to Rouen, demonstrated how profoundly the aerial war had changed. This operation involved 376 B-17 flying fortresses attacking 2 of Germany's most critical industrial targets simultaneously, a force 30 times larger than the initial American raid. The mission planning reflected growing American ambition and the increasing sophistication of strategic bombing doctrine. The intent was to split German fighter defenses by attacking 2 widely separated targets on the same day. The 4th Bombardment Wing, consisting of 146 B-17s led by Colonel Curtis LeMay, would strike the Messerschmitt aircraft factory at Regensburg before continuing south to land at bases in North Africa. Following 30 minutes behind, the 1st Bombardment Wing, with 230 bombers, would attack ball-bearing production facilities at Schweinfurt before returning to England. Weather disruptions destroyed the timing that was critical to the plan's success. The Regensburg force departed at 00:06:20 hours as planned, but thick fog kept the Schweinfurt raiders grounded until 11:18 hours, a delay of nearly 5 hours. This meant German fighters, rather than being forced to divide their attention between 2 simultaneous raids, could engage each formation sequentially with their full strength. The Luftwaffe had time to land, rearm, refuel, and position for a second coordinated attack. For the Regensburg force, the battle began almost immediately after crossing into German airspace. Without fighter escort beyond the Belgian border, the B-17 formations faced wave after wave of Luftwaffe attacks across 150 miles of enemy territory. Hauptmann Georg Peter Ader, flying with Jagdgeschwader 1, later described the scene. "We counted nearly 150 American bombers in multiple formations, each box stacked precisely like the ones before. The sky was filled with them. Our ground controllers were directing Staffeln from across western Germany to intercept. It was the largest aerial battle we had yet seen. The tactics employed by both sides represented the culmination of 18 months of aerial combat evolution. German fighters attacked in coordinated waves, with some units making head-on passes while others targeted stragglers and damaged bombers from the flanks. Twin-engine Me-110 and Ju-88 fighters, equipped with heavier cannon armament, attempted to stand off beyond 50 caliber range and lob 21 cm rockets into the formations, hoping to break up the tight defensive boxes and create isolated targets. American gunners fired with disciplined intensity, their tracer rounds creating visible streams between the bombers and attacking fighters. Radio chatter documented the chaos as pilots called out fighter positions, gunners reported ammunition status, and formation leaders fought to maintain cohesion despite mounting damage. Aircraft with failing engines dropped behind, instantly becoming priority targets for German fighters who recognized isolated bombers as easier prey. The human cost was staggering on both sides. 24 B-17s from the Regensburg force failed to return, representing 164 men killed, captured, or wounded. German losses included between 25 and 35 fighters destroyed, with many more damaged and several experienced pilots killed. The Schweinfurt raiders, facing freshly rearmed German fighters, suffered even worse. 36 B-17s went down, carrying 360 crewmen to death or captivity. Total American losses for the day: 60 bombers and 600 men. German pilots who participated in these battles returned to base with a mixture of triumph and profound unease. Yes, they had inflicted heavy casualties on the American formations. The loss rate of 16% represented a devastating blow to any air force. But the bombers had reached their targets. Both the Regensburg factory and the Schweinfurt ball-bearing plants suffered significant damage. And most troubling of all, the Americans kept coming. Lieutenant Hans Philipp, who would later become one of Germany's most successful aces before his death in combat, summarized the German predicament in a letter to a fellow pilot. "We are shooting them down in droves. Yesterday alone, our staff claimed 7 confirmed kills. But when we land and look up, there are still bombers in the sky, hundreds of them. We shoot down 10 and 20 more appear the next day. They have inexhaustible resources. We are fighting American industrial production, and we cannot win that battle in the air." The Schweinfurt raid was repeated on October 14, 1943, in what would become known as Black Thursday. This time, 291 B-17s attacked without the complication of a simultaneous raid elsewhere. The result was even more catastrophic. 60 bombers were lost to German fighters and flak, with another 12 so badly damaged they crashed or had to be scrapped upon return. Another 121 bombers returned with moderate to serious damage. Of 2,900 crewmen who departed England that morning, 254 did not return. The loss rate of more than 20% in a single mission was unsustainable by any measure. Bomber crews calculated that if such losses continued, their statistical probability of completing a 25-mission tour approached zero. The 8th Air Force faced a crisis that threatened the viability of the entire daylight bombing campaign. Yet the German celebration of this tactical victory masked a strategic reality that would soon become apparent. The evolution of American bomber formations had forced the Luftwaffe into an untenable position. To effectively attack these massive defensive boxes, German fighters had to mass in large formations and press attacks to close range despite withering defensive fire. This required concentration of fighters that left other areas vulnerable, consumed fuel at unsustainable rates, and exposed German pilots to accumulated risk that steadily eroded the experienced pilot corps that was the Luftwaffe's most irreplaceable asset. German armament specialists studied the problem intensively. Post-battle analysis of gun camera footage revealed that pilots of average ability achieved hit rates of only 2% when firing at combat ranges and speeds. To obtain the 20 hits with 20mm shells typically required to down a B-17, the average pilot needed to fire approximately 1,000 rounds. The best German fighter, the WWII, carried only 500 rounds of 20mm ammunition. Even exceptional pilots, the Expert 10, with dozens of victories, found engaging massed bomber formations challenging due to the concentrated defensive fire. The introduction of heavier armament partially addressed this firepower deficit. The Mk1-S8 30mm cannon, firing 11-ounce high-explosive incendiary rounds at over 600 rounds per minute, could destroy a heavy bomber with an average of 3 hits. The 21 cm WFR JAR 21 rocket, adapted from an Army infantry weapon, carried a 90-pound warhead, powerful enough to destroy any bomber within 30 yards of detonation. These weapons gave German fighters the ability to inflict catastrophic damage when they connected, but also reduced maneuverability and made the fighters more vulnerable to American escort fighters that were beginning to appear in increasing numbers. By early 1944, the fundamental equation of the air war over Europe had shifted decisively against the Luftwaffe. The appearance of P-51 Mustang escort fighters with sufficient range to accompany bomber formations to any target in Germany meant that German fighters could no longer attack bombers with relative impunity. The P-51s, P-47 Thunderbolts with improved range, and P-38 Lightnings created a defensive umbrella that forced German fighters to engage in fighter-versus-fighter combat before they could reach the bombers. Major General Jimmy Doolittle's tactical revolution compounded German problems. Rather than requiring escort fighters to remain tied to bomber formations, Doolittle authorized them to range ahead and engage German fighters before they could form up for coordinated attacks. This fighter sweep doctrine put German fighters on the defensive, forcing them to fight for position against numerically superior American escorts before they could even approach the bomber boxes. The Big Week offensive of February 1944 demonstrated how completely the balance had shifted. Over 6 days, American bombers flew more than 3,800 sorties against German aircraft production facilities, escorted by 3,700 fighter sorties. German fighter losses exceeded 350 aircraft, with pilot casualties approaching 20% of available strength. These losses came not primarily from bomber defensive fire, but from American escort fighters that had achieved air superiority over Reich territory. German pilots found themselves trapped in an impossible tactical situation. The massive bomber formations they had learned to attack with head-on passes and concentrated firepower were now protected by swarms of long-range fighters that could outperform most German aircraft. Attempting to reach the bombers meant running a gauntlet of American escorts. Avoiding the escorts meant allowing the bombers to reach their targets unopposed. Either choice led to strategic defeat. Oberst Johannes Steinhoff, a Luftwaffe fighter commander who survived the war, later described the psychological impact. By mid-1944, we knew we had lost the air battle over Germany. The question was no longer if the bombers would reach their targets, but how many of our pilots would survive the day's missions. The Americans had achieved what we thought impossible. They had created formations so large, so well defended, and so well escorted that our defensive tactics became irrelevant. We were overwhelmed by their industrial capacity to produce bombers faster than we could shoot them down, and fighters faster than we could train pilots to fly them. The scale of American bomber operations grew beyond anything German planners had imagined possible. By the spring of 1944, the 8th Air Force could launch missions involving over 1,000 heavy bombers, supported by 700 or more escort fighters. These massive formations required hours to assemble over England, with different bomb groups forming, up at assigned altitudes and positions, before the entire force streamed toward continental Europe in a procession that could stretch for over 100 miles. German radar operators watching these formations build on their screens reported feelings approaching disbelief. The first time we tracked a force of over 800 bombers forming up, I thought our equipment had malfunctioned, recalled a radar technician stationed near Hamburg. The scope showed so many returns, it appeared almost solid. We reported it to command, who initially dismissed it as impossible. Then the reconnaissance aircraft confirmed it. 800 American bombers headed for Berlin. We knew at that moment that Germany could not win this war. The psychological effect on German civilians and military personnel was profound. The sight and sound of massive bomber formations passing overhead, their contrails marking the sky with parallel lines stretching from horizon to horizon, created a visceral understanding of American industrial might that no propaganda could counter. The knowledge that these formations would return tomorrow and the day after, regardless of losses inflicted, gradually eroded confidence in ultimate victory. German fighter pilots, particularly the younger replacements arriving at frontline units with minimal training, faced a psychological burden that approached unbearable. Veterans described watching the faces of new pilots during mission briefings, seeing the color drain when intelligence officers described the size of incoming bomber formations. Many of these boys had less than 100 hours of total flight time, recalled Major Gerhard Barkhorn, another high-scoring ace who survived the war. We sent them against formations of hundreds of bombers protected by hundreds of fighters. It was not combat, it was murder. The final evolution of German tactics reflected desperation rather than innovation. The formation of Sturmgruppen, heavily armored and armed FW-190s, specifically tasked with breaking up bomber formations through massed frontal attacks, represented a recognition that conventional fighter tactics had failed. These assault fighters, laden with additional armor plating and heavy cannon, sacrificed speed and maneuverability for survivability and firepower. Protected by conventional fighters tasked with engaging American escorts, the Sturmgruppen would mass for coordinated head-on attacks, hoping to destroy enough bombers to disrupt the formation and create opportunities for follow-up attacks. In practice, these tactics achieved only limited success. The heavily laden assault fighters proved vulnerable to American escorts that had learned to recognize their distinctive profiles and tactics. The Sturmgruppen suffered catastrophic loss rates, with some units losing 75% of their strength in a single month of operations. German pilots described these missions with fatalistic acceptance, knowing that survival depended more on luck than skill. By late 1944, the transformation was complete. The small formation of 12 B-17s that had inaugurated American strategic bombing in August 1942 had evolved into thousand-plane raids that struck multiple targets simultaneously across Germany. The defensive firepower that had initially stunned German fighter pilots now mattered less than the overwhelming numbers and coordination that American industrial capacity enabled. The combat box formations that had seemed so revolutionary in 1943 were now just one element of a comprehensive air superiority campaign that included long-range escorts, radar-guided pathfinding, and strategic targeting of German fuel production. German pilots who had mocked the early American bombing attempts in 1942, who had confidently predicted that daylight strategic bombing would prove as futile for the Americans as it had for the British, now watched helplessly as formations they could not hope to stop passed overhead daily. The Luftwaffe, which had dominated European skies from 1939 through 1942, had been systematically destroyed, not through tactical innovation or operational brilliance, but through the application of overwhelming material superiority, organized into formations that rendered individual skill and courage increasingly irrelevant. The final statistics of the American strategic bombing campaign reflected the transformation from those tentative first missions to ultimate dominance. From August 1942 through May 1945, 8th Air Force heavy bombers flew 291,508 sorties, dropping 640,036 tons of bombs on European targets. They claimed 6,098 German aircraft destroyed in aerial combat, though post-war analysis suggests the actual number was closer to 4,000 when duplicated claims and misidentifications were eliminated. The cost was staggering. 4,154 bombers lost in combat operations, representing approximately 47,000 crewmen killed, wounded, or captured. For the Luftwaffe, the cost of defending against these formations proved even more catastrophic. The fighter arm lost approximately 28,000 pilots killed in combat against Western Allied air forces, with many thousands more wounded or captured. Aircraft losses approached 40,000 fighters destroyed or damaged beyond repair. By the spring of 1945, fuel shortages, lack of trained pilots, and the overwhelming numerical superiority of Allied air forces had rendered the Luftwaffe combat ineffective. The sophisticated defensive system that had initially challenged American daylight bombing had been systematically destroyed by the very formations it was designed to counter. In the end, the German pilots' initial assessment of American massed bomber formations as tactically vulnerable proved correct in isolation. Individual combat boxes could be attacked and disrupted with coordinated fighter tactics and heavy armament. But this tactical truth missed the strategic reality that American industrial capacity could replace losses faster than Germany could inflict them. The formations that had stunned German pilots with their defensive firepower in 1943 had evolved by 1945 into components of an air campaign so massive that tactical considerations became almost irrelevant. The tactical intricacies of attacking these formations became increasingly complex as the war progressed. German fighter units developed elaborate attack sequences that required coordination between multiple Staffeln operating at different altitudes and approach vectors. A typical large-scale interception might involve high-altitude fighters positioning ahead of the bomber stream to make initial head-on passes, followed by dive attacks from above by fighters that had climbed to extreme altitudes, while a third group positioned itself to attack stragglers and damage bombers from the flanks and rear. Communication between German fighters during these coordinated attacks relied on radio calls that directed pilots to specific targets and attack positions. Ground controllers vectored fighters toward incoming formations, providing altitude, heading, and estimated strength. Once visual contact was established, formation leaders would assign sectors and attack sequences designed to maximize disruption of the defensive box. The complexity of these operations demanded experience and training that became increasingly rare as veteran pilots were killed and replacement training was compressed to meet desperate need. Individual bomber crews within these massive formations experienced the air war in intensely personal terms that statistics cannot capture. Tail gunners, isolated in their small turrets at the rear of the aircraft, watched wave after wave of German fighters approach, tracking their angle and speed to determine when they entered effective range. Their 50 caliber guns, firing through restricted arcs of movement, represented the last line of defense against stern attacks. Many tail gunners never completed their tour of duty, the casualty rate in this position approaching 50% on some missions. Ball turret gunners, suspended beneath the bomber in spherical turrets barely large enough to contain a human body, faced perhaps the most psychologically challenging position. Curled in a fetal position with their weapons and ammunition, unable to wear parachutes due to space constraints, they were acutely aware that any damage to the turret mechanism could leave them trapped. Yet their position provided crucial defensive coverage of the bomber's vulnerable underside, and their gunnery often meant the difference between survival and destruction. The physical environment within these formations was as challenging as the tactical situation. At altitudes frequently exceeding 25,000 feet, temperatures dropped to minus 40 or 50 degrees Fahrenheit. The unpressurized aircraft required crew members to wear oxygen masks throughout the mission, with failure of oxygen systems leading to hypoxia that could kill within minutes. Frostbite was common, particularly among gunners whose positions exposed them to slipstream wind at several hundred miles per hour. Many gunners finished missions with frozen hands and feet, unable to remove their flight boots without assistance. The noise level inside a B-17 during combat operations was almost unimaginable. 4 Wright Cyclone engines, each producing over 1,200 horsepower, created a roar that made verbal communication impossible without the aircraft's intercom system. When defensive guns opened fire, the concussion from muzzle blast added to the cacophony. Pilots reported that after particularly intense missions, their hearing would be impaired for hours or days, with many suffering permanent hearing loss from cumulative exposure to combat noise levels. German pilots, observing these formations from their cockpits, developed a grudging respect for the men who continued to fly despite casualties that would have broken less determined forces. In post-war interviews, many Luftwaffe veterans acknowledged that, whatever other qualities American bomber crews might have lacked, their courage and determination were beyond question. The sight of damaged B-17s maintaining formation despite engines on fire, control surfaces shot away, and visible holes in fuselages large enough to walk through, created a lasting impression on friend and foe alike. The maintenance of these massive bomber formations required logistical capabilities that were themselves revolutionary. Each B-17 consumed approximately 100 gallons of aviation fuel per hour, meaning a single mission by a 1,000-bomber force required over 600,000 gallons of fuel. This fuel had to be transported across the Atlantic by tanker, distributed to dozens of airfields across England, and then loaded into individual aircraft along with bombs, ammunition, oxygen, and other mission essentials. The scale of this logistics operation exceeded many nations' entire military capabilities. Ammunition consumption was similarly staggering. Each bomber carried approximately 6,000 rounds of 50 caliber ammunition distributed across its defensive gun positions. A 1,000-bomber mission therefore required 6 million rounds to be manufactured, transported, stored, distributed, and loaded. American ammunition plants, staffed largely by women working round-the-clock shifts, produced these rounds by the hundreds of millions, maintaining quality control standards that ensured reliable feeding and firing under extreme conditions. The replacement of lost aircraft and crew represented perhaps the most remarkable aspect of American industrial and training capacity. A bomber and crew lost over Germany could be replaced within a week. New B-17s rolled off assembly lines in Seattle, Long Beach, and Tulsa, at rates approaching 15 aircraft per day at peak production. Replacement crews graduated from training programs that had been systematically expanded to produce thousands of pilots, navigators, bombardiers, and gunners monthly. This replacement pipeline ensured that despite horrific losses during missions like Schweinfurt and Regensburg, American bomber strength continued to grow rather than diminish. German fighter pilots found themselves caught in an attritional death spiral they could not escape. Each mission against massed bomber formations carried substantial risk regardless of skill or experience. The accumulated probability of death or serious injury approached certainty for pilots flying regular combat operations. Unlike the American system that rotated aircrew out of combat after a specified number of missions, the Luftwaffe kept pilots in combat until they were killed, captured, or so severely wounded they could no longer fly. This policy ensured that even the most successful pilots eventually fell victim to the law of averages. The degradation of German pilot quality as the war progressed created a vicious cycle that accelerated Luftwaffe losses. Experienced pilots, those with dozens or hundreds of combat missions, possessed skills that allowed them to survive encounters that would kill less experienced aviators. They understood how to position their aircraft for maximum advantage, when to press an attack and when to break away, how to manage energy and ammunition during extended combat. As these veterans were killed, they were replaced by pilots with minimal training who fell victim to American guns at appalling rates, further reducing average experience levels and increasing loss rates. By 1945, some German fighter pilots were entering combat with less than 50 hours of total flight time and virtually no gunnery or combat training. These young men, barely out of adolescence, faced veteran American bomber crews who had survived dozens of missions and escort fighter pilots who had themselves accumulated hundreds of combat hours. The outcome of these encounters was tragically predictable. German fighter units reported instances of entire staffel of replacement pilots being wiped out in their first week of operations, sometimes in their first combat mission. The lesson that German pilots learned, at a cost measured in thousands of lives and hundreds of destroyed aircraft, was that modern industrial warfare had rendered traditional concepts of tactical air combat obsolete. When one side could produce bombers by the thousands, train crews by the tens of thousands, and replace losses within days, the other side's tactical excellence meant nothing without equivalent industrial capacity. The massed bomber formations that darkened European skies in 1944 and 1945 represented not just a tactical innovation, but a fundamental shift in the nature of warfare itself, one that German pilots recognized too late to matter. If you found this deep dive into World War II aviation history fascinating, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. We explore the untold stories and forgotten details of history's greatest conflicts, bringing you comprehensive analyses that go beyond the surface level. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our next historical investigation, and leave a comment below telling us what aspect of the air war you'd like us to cover next. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.